May it please the court, opposing counsel, members of the jury. This was Matthew Guerra and Savanah Soto. But this was also Matthew Guerra and Savanah Soto, and their son that they were going to name Fabian. You're going to hear that they lived a lifestyle that many of us don't understand, we don't identify with, and we don't agree with. You're going to hear that they made choices that many of us would not make. But the penalty for those poor choices should not be execution. And the evidence is going to prove to you that on December 21st of 2023, that is exactly what Christopher Preciado did to them and their unborn baby. He executed them. And for no other reason than he needed money and Matthew had a lot of it. You see, even though Matthew and Savanah were not perfect, as none of us are, they were excited to welcome Fabian into the world. And on December 23rd of 2023, that was what they were going to do. They had an appointment at the hospital because Savanah was past her due date and she was set to be induced. And you're going to hear that their family and loved ones went to the hospital for that momentous occasion. And when they got there, they waited, and Savanah and Matthew did not show up. You're going to hear that they called them and they got no answer. You're going to hear that they went to their apartment and they looked for them and they were not there, but the apartment looked fine. So they reported them as missing. And you're going to hear for 3 days, their families searched and scoured and used all of the resources at their disposal to try to find them. They used the news, the internet, social media, flyers, you name it. They did it for 3 days until December 26th. And on December 26th, you're going to hear that one of Savanah's friends, Joni, got a message the day after Christmas that somebody thought they had found Matthew's car. And so Joni sent that information to law enforcement, and then her and 2 of Savanah's brothers went to that location, an apartment complex at 5903 Danny K. And they're going to tell you that it took them a minute to find the car because it was parked in the furthest corner of that complex up against a fence next to a pile of scrap lumber. And when they got there, they saw something that they had hoped and prayed they would never find. She's going to tell you that as she walked up to that car and she looked inside, she saw Savanah in the passenger seat, dead. Covered in junk, the baby carrier on her belly. And you're going to hear that she was so distraught by this discovery, she didn't even notice Matthew lying down in the back seat, also dead. You're going to hear that thankfully, right about the same time as Joni and Savanah's brothers got there, law enforcement arrived as well. And with the more and more family of the 2 that arrived, it became an emotionally charged scene. And they had to do everything they could to protect the integrity of that crime scene and whatever evidence might have still been there, because they didn't know how long that car had been sitting and how long their bodies had been sitting. And you're going to hear that paramedics got there. They broke into the car because it was locked. And they checked and they verified that they were gone and had apparently been for a while. And then investigators took over. You're going to hear they processed the car, they collected evidence, they took photographs. And once the ME's office came and took Savanah and Matthew's bodies, they were able to actually get inside and see what they were dealing with, because at first they couldn't tell. And you're going to hear that the more that they looked, the more they evaluated what was there and what wasn't. This was adding up more and more like someone did this to them and not like they did this to themselves. You're going to hear that they did not find a gun in that car. You're going to hear that there were items that you would think would be there of value that were not, including Matthew's wallet, his ID, money, some rings that he regularly wore on his hands. Savanah didn't have a purse. You're going to hear that based on the lack of evidence and the actual evidence that was there, including the bullet wounds to their heads, this was looking like someone did this to them. So they started their capital murder investigation. And you're going to hear that, like many of these investigations, they looked for one of the most common things that we jump to, which is surveillance video. And thankfully, they found some at that apartment complex. Not as much as we would have wanted, and not in all the places we would have hoped. But they got some. And from that video and the evidence they recovered in Matthew's car, they were able to develop leads. And they followed those leads because it gave them an idea of who the suspect might be and what kind of car they might be in. And the more they looked, the more the trail led directly to the front door of Christopher Preciado. Because what law enforcement didn't know at the time, but would later find out, is that Christopher and Matthew knew each other. Christopher was a client of Matthew's and would buy marijuana from him on occasion. And you're going to hear that on the night of December 21st of 2023, Matthew and Chris had an agreement, an arrangement. They were going to meet at Chris's house to do a transaction. So when Savanah and Matthew got into their car around 11:45 that night and drove straight to his house, they had no idea that they would never return home. Because when they pulled up, Christopher got in the back seat with a gun, and within a minute or so, he shot them in the side and in the back of the head. And what you are not going to hear, what the evidence is not going to show, is that right after he did that, he called 911 and said, "I did this, but I did it in self-defense. I did it because I was afraid for my life." You're not going to hear that he did that. You're not going to hear that after he shot Matthew and his pregnant girlfriend, that he said he did it because he was afraid or because Matthew had threatened him. But here they are, and she's pregnant. Get help. No, what you're going to hear is that after he shot them in the head, he moved Matthew's lifeless body into the back seat. He got in the driver's seat next to Savanah, and he drove them to that apartment complex less than a mile from his house where he would dump the bodies. And on the way there, he called his parents. And he asked them to meet him so he could have a ride home. And you're going to hear that when he got to that apartment, he found the most obscure, far-off corner where he could park that car next to that pile of scrap lumber up against a fence in hopes that it wouldn't be found for a while. And then he wiped it down, and then he got in his dad's truck with his parents, and he went home, where he seemingly hid out for a while. Because from the time he killed them to the time he was found, 13 days passed. They were in that car for 5 days before they were found. 5 days he left them there. Now you're going to hear that once the police got to the door of Christopher Preciado, that's the first time he says that he was a victim. But the evidence isn't going to support that. We talked in jury selection about the elements of self-defense and what is required, those 4 legs of that chair. And you're going to hear that the evidence does not support any of those elements. You're going to hear from Detective Goodwin, who was the lead investigator on this case. And he's going to tell you that the more he evaluated, the more he investigated, the more he uncovered, the more inconsistent Christopher's story was with the facts and the evidence. You're also going to hear from Dr. Molina, who is the medical examiner. She examined both of their bodies. And she's going to tell you that the physical evidence, the locations of their gunshot wounds, the trajectories of the bullets through their heads, that's physical evidence that doesn't lie. And she's going to tell you, based on the evaluation of that evidence, the way Chris explained this happening is not consistent with that scientific evidence. Because again, the evidence is not going to support a justification here, because he did not do this because he was in fear for his life. He did it for money. He did it because he needed it, and Matthew had it. That's what the evidence is going to support. Now, because of the nature of the case, I have to warn you, there are going to be things that you're going to hear and that you're going to see that are going to be difficult. But like we talked about during jury selection, we have to prove every single one of these elements beyond a reasonable doubt for every single one of these counts. And we have to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. So we're going to have to bring you that hard evidence, but we will try our best to be sensitive to the nature of the evidence. But we have to bring it to you for Matthew and Savanah and for Fabian. Because at the end of the day, you're going to hear that there was nothing that happened in that car on that night that justified Christopher Preciado and taking out a gun and taking out an entire family in less than 30 seconds. So we're going to ask that you hold him accountable for that and that you find him guilty of all 3 counts of capital murder.
May I proceed, Your Honor? Members of the jury, there's no doubt that this is a difficult case. People die. That loss is real, it deserves respect, and it will not be minimized. But your job is not to measure grief or to assign moral blame. It's to answer a very specific legal question of whether or not the state has proven those allegations and all those elements in the indictment that you just saw beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard exists for moments like this, exactly like this, because there can be no rush to judgment here. Now, the prosecutor laid out her theory of the case and what she believed the evidence would show, and there were a lot of assumptions in that theory. What she did not say, and what we believe the evidence will show, is that there are no eyewitnesses to this offense. Nobody's going to testify that said they saw Christopher Preciado pull a trigger with any sort of intent or deliberation. There's no video evidence of this crime that took place. You're not going to receive any blood spatter evidence that implicates him in this capital murder. There's no DNA evidence that's going to implicate him of capital murder. The evidence will show you're not going to find any evidence of fingerprints of any kind that would implicate him in this capital murder. And there's going to be no gunshot residue evidence that puts a gun in his hand on the date of the offense. You may hear opinions, you may hear interpretations, but opinions and interpretations, even beliefs, are not enough. And the law draws a distinction between beliefs, even experienced beliefs, and what the evidence will show and what is needed to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. You will hear or may hear that my client gave a statement to the police, but he did not confess to a crime. He did not admit to shooting anybody deliberately. He described a chaotic situation, a drug transaction gone wrong where a gun is pulled on him by the drug dealer, a struggle, and then chaos when shots are fired after that. That is not capital murder. You also hear what happened afterwards. You may hear evidence about an attempt to move the vehicle, an attempt to conceal or clean. Actions done, particularly the cleaning, by Ramon Preciado, Christopher's father, not by him. It's not commendable. It's not perhaps what you or I might have done, but you may hear evidence of panic or fear given his youth. And you will hear evidence that will garner strong reactions, and it is human to react strongly to this. But the law requires that you separate tragedy from intent and suspicion from certainty. Capital murder is the most serious accusation the law allows. Its proof to convict on it must be of the highest caliber. When you examine the evidence closely and you separate the science from the inference, you'll see that a lot of the state's theory is not as firmly established as they claim it to be. You may hear that a weapon was found in this case, that the state will try to link to Christopher Preciado, but the evidence will also show you that that weapon was found in the bedroom closet of his parents' bedroom. It's not his gun. If the evidence at the end of this trial leaves you with a reasonable doubt as to intent in this case, then a conviction for capital murder cannot stand. At the end of this trial, my partner and I will ask you to return a verdict of not guilty after you examine all of the evidence. That is not leniency. It is not a technicality. It's faithfulness to the law, to fairness, and to the oath you just took, and the responsibility that's been entrusted to you as jurors. Thank you for your attention.